Hello, everyone. We are live. Welcome to Grid Song. My name is David. I'm your host today, and we are going to be talking about today in Grid Zones. We are going to be talking about our wet sanding through the years. Techniques evolving, and industry secrets. And, and again, I want to welcome everyone to another episode of Grit Zones, where the industry talks about grit. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most important finishing techniques in automotive refinishing, wet sanding. Whether you're a painter, body technician, restoration specialist, detail, or DIY enthusiast, today we're going to discuss the history of wet sanding, the different wet sanding techniques, common mistakes technicians make, where wet sanding is headed in the future. We'll also touch on how new sanding technologies are changing the game, introducing products like ForcedG.R.I.T. Well, let's start with where wet sanding came from. Many younger technicians don't realize wet sanding has been around for nearly a century. Back in the 1920s and the 1930s, automotive paint systems were completely different than what we use today. Painters were working with lacquer paints, enamels, finishes, hand rubbing finishes, natural abrasives. Because these paints dried differently, technicians needed ways to smooth imperfections, and water became the answer. Water helped, for us, it lubricated the surface, it reduced clogging, it carried away sanding residue, extended paper life. By the 1950s, wet sanding became standard practice for high-end paint code correction. The custom car movement exploded in the 1960s, and exploded in the 1960s. Builders wanted mirror finishes, deep gloss, show car reflections. Wet sanding became a required skill. A lot of legendary builders spent more time color sanding than spraying. That did a lot. Here's some things you might want to consider, or you may want to even question. And you want to always consider the obvious. What was basically the first year you learned wet sanding? I was probably about 12 years old at the time. Me and my dad, my dad owned a body shop, and we wet sanded everything. Every single car we wet sanded. That was a pretty unique time for me because that's the first time I got introduced to it. who taught you how to wet sand? You know, was it part of the process where you were, or did someone show it to you for the first time? Today's technicians often don't realize how much labor older painters invested. Some show cars required 20 hours of wet sanding, some 40 hours, and some even 80 hours. Our wet sanding and polishing, with wet sanding and polishing, paint technology improved, but exceptions also increased. Well, not exceptions, but expectations. Customers today expect factory quality finishes every time. Wet sanding techniques. Let's discuss those. There isn't one wet sanding method. There are several. There's a straight line sanding. A very just guided sanding is going back and forth. Many experienced technicians prefer the straight strokes. The benefits from that is, better panel control, easier scratch identification, more consistent leveling. They question who still sands in the straight lines. Who still does sand in a straight line. It just kind of depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to take out orange peel, you're going to be a little bit more all over the place. You're going to probably use like a DA, the wet sand with. That does do pretty well with getting out orange peel. But sometimes, orange peel is required. That's your factory standard. It helps hide any imperfections. You don't want it too glossy. And of course, you see the moment a scratch appears. Okay. The other technique is cross hatch pattern. This involves sanding horizontal and then vertical, creating a crisscross pattern. Benefits of that is, uniform leveling, reducing low spots, better panel consistency. Many restoration shops still use this approach. Block wet sanding. This separates professionals from beginners. Anyone can hold sandpaper. Not everyone can maintain panel flatness. A sanding block distributes pressure evenly without a block. Fingers, marks occur, wet waves develop, surface distortion happens. This becomes obvious under direct sunlight. You can pretty much see it once you have the vehicle out, and you can kind of tell where your hand's been. So it's always better to use some type of device, some type of block that will help keep your patterns consistent. Spot repair, wet sanding. This is often used for dirt, dust nibs, small runs, and minor defects. This method focuses only on the affected area. The challenge is blending the repair without creating halos. That's something too that is very important. Let's see here. Another question for you. What's your preferred sequence, when it comes down to you sanding your particular repair? Do you use the method of 1500 and 2000 and 3000? Or do you skip the 1500 and do the 2000, then the 3000? And are you one who still uses and starts with 1000? That's always a challenge, getting out 1000 scratches. that's always a that's strictly for the professionals. I wouldn't recommend anyone starting out to try to challenge yourself with using 1,000 grit. Okay. Common mistakes, you know. Um, let's talk about, costly mistakes. Everybody has made them. That's I've made a few. That's part of that. That is definitely part of it. Too much pressure. Many technicians think harder sanding equals faster sanding. Usually, the opposite is true. Heavy pressure causes deep scratches, uneven surfaces, and premature paper wear. Okay? You actually wear out your paper um, quicker. You definitely wear your paper out. You know, skipping grits. That's one of the biggest mistakes. A technician starts with 1,500 grit, then jumps directly to 5,000 grit. Yeah, the results there, previous scratches remain hidden until polishing. And once you got it all polished up, now you're just polishing scratches. That's what's left behind because you jumped too many grits. Because remember, one grit takes out the other. And the most common dangerous mistake is contaminated water, which creates random scratches. When I first started out, we had this bucket that we always go to, but sometimes what's down in the bottom of that bucket would end up on the sandpaper, and that causes a lot of problems. So always use clean water. Yeah, that's highly recommended. Okay. Um, a single piece of debris can ruin a whole panel, and by the time you see it, it's pretty much too late. Proper lighting, you cannot fix what you can't see. Okay, many sanding defects, um, many sanding defects are lighting issues, not technical issues. Professional lighting changes everything. Yeah, yes, it does. Um, let's see here. Let's see here. Okay. Okay. Well, I think it's um, I think we can talk a little bit about the industry. You know, I want to ask you all, what's the most expensive mistake you've ever made wet sanding? Is it a burn through, a repaint, entire panel redo? Everyone has a story. You know, I've had my few. Um, not too many, but I can probably say most costly one I had to deal with was repainting this Corvette. And uh, once we applied the heat, there's an area that probably needed to be sanded some more. So underneath that material, it started to form a bubble because it wasn't sanded down properly correctly. So yeah, we had to redo that front bumper on that Corvette. um, that's my story. Uh, but the future of sanding is probably going to be a little different. The industry is changing. Paint systems continue to evolve, uh, pr- uh, produce flatter finishes, reduce cycle times, and improve profitability. Yeah. Let's see here. the, well, let's see here. Let's take a look. Once again, let's take a look at the future of wet sanding. You know, the industry is changing. Paint systems continue to evolve. Technicians face increasing pressure to, produce flatter finishes, recycle time, reduce recycle times, improve profitability. Now abrasives are emerging. New abrasives are emerging. New form technologies are emerging. New sanding systems are emerging. The challenge remains the same. How do we achieve maximum flatness without minimal uh, labor? Shops today are measuring, through throughput, uh, labor efficiency, cycle time, more than ever before. Technology is being designed around those goals. Okay, product discussion. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about, where ForcedG.R.I.T may fit into this. Let's spend a few minutes, just a few, discussing innovation. The industry has always, the industry has always searched for ways to improve consistency, flatness, speed. ForcedG.R.I.T was developed around that challenge. Instead of relying entirely on hand pressure and feel, the magnetic stabilization concept helps technicians maintain controlled, measured contact with the surface. And as we all want to also mention, you want to improve panel leveling, reduce operator fatigue, greater consistency, faster material removal. That's another one. The goal isn't replacing technique. That's definitely something we don't want to do at all. We don't want to replace technique because technique is, is what gives the enhancement to any tool. Okay. Yeah, you definitely want to let's see. Okay. But all in all, you always want to have the goal is always isn't to replace the technique. The goal is to enhance technique. The better the foundation, the better the finish. And that's basically, paint and repair. Repair and paint. You know, it's all about the prep work. It definitely finalized with the paint work, but if you don't have good prep work, you're kind of you're setting yourself up for a situation. Um, Absolutely, every time. The goal isn't to replace the technique. The goal is to enhance the technique. The better the foundation, the better the finish. So that's what I would include for today. If I have questions for you, if you have any questions for us, feel free to leave it in the chat. Feel free to leave it in the chat. Things like, what grid sequence works best for you. What was the hardest wet sanding lesson you learned? What sanding topic should be covered? What sanding topic should we cover next? We can talk about a lot of different things. This is the place where you can, get those questions answered or ask those questions. We don't mind at all. And how modern sanding systems changed your workflow. depending on what you use. And there's a lot of great systems out there. These systems they do a good job, and we always want to recognize that. So, feel free to visit us at ForcedGR.I.T and also on our Shopify account, whoyouLike.myshopify.com. Okay, that's always a favorite. Okay. Make sure you subscribe, share, and join us next week as we continue discussing the tools, techniques, and technologies surrounding the future of automotive refinishing. Again, I'm your host. I am David, and welcome to Grit Zones. And we will be back here, not next week, as I mentioned earlier. We'll probably be back here on Friday. Again, you all have a great day. Have a good night, and thank you for your time. We appreciate it.